Casey, Drew called for her. She looked up and waved, leaving the conversation with the archaeologist she had found to rejoin Drew. The gravel truck tipped the last of its load as they left the stones behind them. "Ah, thank goodness for that. Now we can get the digger back down here and clear some of this earth," Samson muttered as they stomped away. "They're amazing," Casey enthused to Drew. "Yes, they are rather, aren't they?" Samson agreed. "Are you also helping Constable Gates with his inquiries?" he asked politely. "Yes, I'm down from Scotland Yard as well. I'm a colleague of the inspector's," she told him. They shook hands as the gravel scrunched underfoot. "Dr. Ward, Casey Ward," she told him. "Dr. Christopher Sampson, pleased to meet you," he told her. The inspector is a very nice chap, Sampson smiled. Drew had charged ahead, keen to keep them moving through the cold afternoon. "Yes, he is," Casey replied, realising she was just one member of a bigger community of experts and helpers that the inspector surrounded himself with. "Where is he today?" Sampson asked, looking about for him. "He's fallen ill," Casey replied, trying to hide the worry in her voice. "Oh dear, nothing too serious, I hope," Sampson replied, sounding a little more concerned. "Oh, I doubt it. He'll be back on his feet before we know it," Casey replied with a smile. They reached the car, and Drew opened the back door for Dr. Sampson. "Mind your head on the way in, sir," Drew told him out of habit. "How exciting. I've never ridden in a police car before," Sampson told him excitedly. They were soon at the Firestone roundabout, and Drew pulled up on the road that headed toward the Green Man. "Where is this monument of yours, then?" Sampson asked excitedly. "We just drove past it, actually. It's over there." They all climbed out, and Drew led them back along the road and over to the roundabout. "Oh yes, I see. Well." Sampson walked about it for a moment, then approached and studied it closer. "Well, this is very interesting." "Oh yes, how so?" Drew asked. "Well, it's hard to tell as some of it is buried, but this appears to be a lintel from the site of the stones." He studied it again. "It could even be the lintel that's missing from the two stones that are standing that we uncovered," he informed them, a little awestruck, his excitement visibly growing. "I never expected it to be so obvious out here exposed. The others are all so well hidden. Wonder how it ended up all the way down here." He shook his head and tried to imagine what could have possessed the ancient inhabitants of Firestone to perform such acts. He took a good look around the stone, measuring it up, calculating its potential size. "It certainly seems to be the right sort of size to be the lintel," he nodded to himself thoughtfully. "And these lighter patches of stone suggest it spent many centuries sat upon something of similar dimensions, though it's impossible to tell, of course, as it's partially buried." He pointed out the part of the stone he meant. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention. What sort of things do you want to know about it?" "I think you have answered all my questions with what you've discovered." Drew studied the stone with Casey and Sampson. "I'll take a few measurements of it, then we can head back up there and see if we can confirm our theory," Sampson suggested. "That would be interesting," Drew agreed. In the absence of a tape measure, Dr. Sampson began taking rough measurements with his handspan. "These types of structures are made very precisely," he told them as he totted up the size of the exposed stone. "Which means if we take just a rough guess at its length," he measured his way across the edge, "I can make a pretty good guess to see if it would fit across the stones." He scratched his head. "Right, I think that should do it." They all bundled back into Drew's car, and he returned them to the stones. They ran up the gravel. The lorry that had laid it now moved on, and the truck and the digger were working hard shifting the pile of mud around the stones. Sampson walked up to them quickly. They were now completely free of the mud and stood staggeringly tall. Their fallen comrades laid about them, slowly being revealed by the careful hands of the army men and the archaeologists. They were joined by Simon, who began talking him through their finds. "Look, you can see where the stones used to be a circle." He looked about the fallen stones, pointing to the ground where they had been toppled. 2 were pushed inward, 4 more were pushed outward. Whoever did this then attempted to smash them to pieces. In the centre lay a scattering of rocks, slowly being revealed from below the last pile of mud. "Here, look at this." Sampson took them into the woods. "This one was toppled and pulled away into the trees." He indicated to the soldiers hacking their way around a fallen monolith. "These 2, he indicated the only 2 stones still standing. "I suppose they couldn't topple, or wouldn't." He regarded the 2 stones. "Fascinating, Simon, but you'll never believe what Constable Gates has just shown me," Sampson interrupted, unable to hide his excitement any longer. "Oh my, what now?" Simon replied. "The lintel that used to sit across these 2, we think," Sampson replied eagerly. "Now let's see." He began measuring the width of the stones and the distance between them. Simon stood in an awed daze. "What, here, on this site? How could you tell?" Simon asked, rather shocked. "No, it's just down the road," Sampson explained. "I'm just trying to work out if my rough measurements add up," he explained. "The exposed part of the stone comes up to here." He drew a line in the mud with the heel of his boot. "If it is the lintel, then it means there's still about another 2/3 of it buried, about 6 feet. That would make it about 9 feet in all." "Fascinating, but what does it mean?" Casey asked. "What should we do?" Drew thought he had an idea of what the inspector would want to do, but he didn't know exactly how he would go about it. As they considered the stones, one of the policemen from the entrance came running up the newly gravelled path towards them. "Drew!" he called, out of breath and panting. "All right, George, what's up?" Drew replied. "We've just had a call through from the station. The inspector is awake and asking for you." Casey practically jumped with glee. "Well, we'd best be off to see him then. Thank you for the tour, gentlemen." We shall return with the inspector, see what he makes of it all, Drew informed them. Right you are, Constable. Doctor. Sampson nodded to Casey respectfully again. Doctor. Casey nodded back and followed Drew back to his car. Chapter 89. Casey and Drew burst into the bar of the Green Man to find the inspector tucking heartily into a roast lamb dinner with a pleased-looking landlady standing behind him watching. He looked up momentarily from his food to see them enter and waved them over to join him while he chewed. Good afternoon, he greeted them as they sat down. Good afternoon, Inspector. How are you feeling? Casey asked. Still a little weak, Doctor, the inspector admitted. I hope I wasn't too much trouble. Mavis advised me that I've been out for the count for about 12 hours. No, you weren't any real trouble. You were asleep for most of it, Casey replied, instinctively taking his wrist to check his pulse. How long have you been awake? She asked. About an hour. I've been coming to slowly and drinking lots of sugary tea. I've literally just sat down to eat 5 minutes before you came in. Casey studied the remains of the food on the plate. Most of it had already been eaten. You're very hungry, I see, she pointed out knowingly. Yes, I feel as though I haven't eaten for days, he admitted. I would like to thank you both for taking care of me while I was ill, he said seriously. You're welcome, Drew replied humbly. And also thank Casey for suggesting roast lamb for my lunch, he commented to Mavis. Yes, well done, me dear, Casey laughed, and left them to it now the inspector had some company. While I wanted to encourage you to eat. Any memory of what happened? Casey asked. Any idea as to what might have made you pass out? The inspector chewed his mouthful thoughtfully for a moment. He knew exactly what had caused him to pass out. It had been the effects of the world he had visited on his body, but he wasn't about to tell them that. Nothing comes to mind immediately, he told them blankly. I seem to remember something to do with the Firestone. Drew and Casey glanced at each other. What can you remember about it exactly? Drew asked. It was the last thing you said before you passed out. You stared at the standing stones and shouted, The Firestone, Drew informed him. The inspector nodded. Well, I knew there was something about that stone. I took some samples and I received the results a few days ago. I suspect the rock will be an exact match to the stones at the site, but I'd like to ask Dr. Sampson for a second opinion.
Drew smiled.
No need. While you were recovering, Casey and I asked the good doctor to have a look at the Firestone. He immediately recognised it and took some measurements. He agrees that it is from the site. In fact, he suspects, as I think you do, that it is the lintel that once connected the two stone pillars, Drew explained. The inspector paused for a moment and took a slow look around the Green Man public house. He considered his options and what they meant for Firestone. He considered future victims of the energy's reach, yet to have been swept away from their homes and dragged through time and space to find their end in the trees of Firestone. He thought of the eyes that Drew had seen and that had appeared in his photographs, travellers that had become lost and were now trapped in the trees. He thought of the missing men of Firestone, caught up in it all and trying to get them home. Well then, it is clear what we have to do, the inspector informed them. He knew what needed to be done, and judging by the readings he had been taking since he regained consciousness, he had to do it soon. It is? Casey asked. She glanced between the inspector and Drew, who sat nodding knowingly to each other. You have to put the Firestone back where it belongs, Drew told her, much to the masked delight of the impressed inspector. We have to replace the lintel. It took a moment for Casey to realise what he meant. Move the stone, she said, aghast. Is that... How? She stammered, flabbergasted. Both men were pleased to see her speechless for once. We should get up to the site, Drew informed the inspector coolly. Speak to Sampson and his team. The inspector nodded in agreement. He had been shoveling food into his mouth the whole time, and his big lunch was almost finished. If we're to shift the stone, we'll need the army men, the digger, all the help we can get, Drew continued seriously. Let's get up there. The inspector finished his last mouthful and stood purposefully. Casey, who had been sat in a stupor, suddenly realised they were preparing to leave, leapt up to pull her coat on. So shocked was she at what they were going to attempt that she had failed to notice the men donning their coats. She chased after them as they flurried out into the street, leaving the pub quiet and peaceful behind them. The drive to the stones was quick. Drew was purposeful, fuelled by the sense of urgency exuded by the inspector. He pulled up by the tape and they all pulled out. A constable pulled back the tape for them and they nodded politely to him as they passed. Nice to see you up and about, Inspector, one of the men called as they rushed past. Thank you, the inspector nodded politely back. Their feet crunched over the gravel, the hard stone giving the route into the trees a confident permanence. Ah, I see the path I ordered a few days ago has finally been laid. Wonderful, the inspector announced with delight as his feet dug into the stone. Drew and Casey exchanged an impressed glance, and they trudged towards the stones. As they approached, Drew spotted the truck parked up, and John the driver reading his paper in his cab. The digger was carefully piling mounds of earth onto the back. They navigated carefully around the commotion, and the inspector quickly found Dr. Sampson, who practically yelled with excitement to see him. Inspector! He rushed up to him and began shaking his hand. How are you feeling? I'm much better, thank you. How are things here? The inspector asked. Very busy and exciting. Let me show you what we've found. I have to say the men are extremely helpful. Wonderful. I see there has been a lot of action here since my last visit. The inspector, Drew and Casey looked about the site. It had developed even since they had last seen it, with more trees removed from around the site, allowing for the digger to move freely to pick up soil from around the stones. Yes, as you can see, a lot more of the stones have been found under the soil. I believe you had a chance to look at the Firestone while I was recovering, the inspector asked. Yes, fascinating. I think it once connected the two remaining stones, you know. Yes, that was my theory, the inspector informed him. I took some samples. I'll see you get copies of the results. I'd like to take some samples of these stones as well. Already done, Sampson informed him. Good work, thank you, the inspector smiled. Now, the next phase of the site would be to have it cleared so we can begin a serious excavation for more artefacts, Sampson informed them. Apologies, Doctor, but I'm not quite finished with it, the inspector informed the excitable man with a friendly smile. I see, sorry, Inspector. So what is the next step for the site, he asked, wondering what else they could possibly do with it. We need to return it to some of its former glory, the inspector informed him. Sampson's face had adopted a confused look as he waited for an explanation. We need to return the lintel to its rightful place, the inspector told him. We need to put the Firestone back atop these two monoliths. Dr. Sampson's face did not lose its look of confusion. You can't mean, was all he managed before the inspector left him and weaved his way through the men and climbed upon a newly uncovered stone. The men all began nodding and greeting him as he passed, aware that the inspector had been unwell and glad to have him back up and at the site with them. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I have your attention? He called about the space. The men immediately downed tools and made their way towards him. All right, lads, here we go, he called to them in encouragement as he downed his spade and they all gathered around the stone that the inspector stood upon. The digger stopped and even John poked his head out of the window of his cab to see what was going on. The inspector waited for everyone to assemble and quieten down. A low hush spread across them. Even the trees leant in to listen. First of all, I want to say a big thank you for all the hard work you have done here. It looks truly impressive, especially compared to what we were faced with just a few days ago. As you can see, this is a site of major historical interest. However, it is not complete, the inspector called to them. There is a piece missing, and today we are going to put it back. There was a murmur of wonder amongst the men. I refer to the lintel, the stone that once sat between these two stones. He motioned to the giant monoliths that dominated the space. It sat here for thousands of years, and then a few hundred years ago some vandals removed it, and it now sits on the Firestone roundabout. The inspector paused to allow the gathered men to chatter for a moment, allowing them to digest the news. Today we make more history, by returning it to its rightful place. There was a collective gasp that echoed around the open space between the dwindling trees. If you could all pick up your tools and get on the bus, I will meet you at the roundabout. The men exchanged amazed glances at the sudden turn of events, then the area burst into a hive of activity. They abandoned the stones and began picking up anything useful and marching down toward the entrance. They took off like a well-oiled machine, even before the Major began yelling at them. Well then, you lot, you heard him, let's get this sortie moving. His voice was brash amongst the branches. Archie, Felix, get down to the bus and get the doors open. Carl, help get these tools shifted back down there. The inspector grabbed Drew. Let's get down to the tape and warn everyone that we're coming out, he told him. Drew nodded. They started off, but the inspector stopped him in contemplation for a moment. You might as well go ahead in the car and prepare the Firestone roundabout. I'll follow with the digger. I'll have to take it down to the other site and get rid of all this soil, but that'll give you time to make the site secure and maybe get a diversion round the roundabout. Get on to Firestone Station and get all available men down to the Firestone roundabout. News is going to travel fast. Let's hope we can get it over with as quickly as possible. We might need to ask Nettlewood nicely if they can spare a few more bobbies. We're going to need to keep people back from the site while we try and dig it up and move it. The inspector was thinking aloud, but Drew paid close attention. Yes, you're right. See you soon, he told him, and confidently raced off towards the entrance to the trees. While the inspector raced off towards the digger, Drew looked round and saw Casey chatting to an archaeologist. He quickened up to her. Look, I'm going to be a bit busy. Will you be all right? She smiled a rather contented smile at having such a fine young man checking up on her. Yes, I'll be fine. You get to work. We can catch up later. Drew nodded gratefully and raced off towards the small crowd of people trying to grab a glance of the stones from behind the police tape. As they approached, people began to call questions at him. What's happening, Drew? One of the assembled townsfolk called out to him. He put up a hand as hello, but made his way to the two officers that stood on the line. There's about to be a lot of activity coming this way, Drew warned them. The inspector is moving the men. Where are they going? The constable asked. They're going to the Firestone, Drew informed them quietly. They're going to dig it up and move it up here. Their jaws dropped in shock, but Drew kept talking. Then they're going to try and put it on top of the other two stones. The two men stood, mouths agape. Drew kept talking. Time was short. You'll need to stay here, but every officer on duty has to get down to the Firestone to stop people getting too close to the digging. Get on the radio and see who's about and send them down there. If you can't find anyone, get on to Nettlewood, Drew instructed him. Yes, Drew, he replied simply, and rushed to his car for his radio. Drew raced off to his car and headed down the hill. Chapter 90. Drew sped down to the Firestone and arrived before anyone else. The space was deserted and rather desolate. The shops were open, but the weather was too cold and too wet for many people to brave going outside. Drew parked his car up on the roundabout and looked anxiously up the road towards the stones. A few minutes later, Jim Moyer and Bob Renwick from Nettlewood appeared in their car and parked up behind Drew. They climbed out, pulled on their helmets, and slowly stalked towards him, arms behind their backs. "Afternoon, Drew. What's occurring?" Jim asked as they approached. Drew waited until he was closer before speaking in a hushed voice. "The Firestone is about to be exhumed," he informed him quietly. "There's about to be a lot of men and dangerous equipment coming down here from the site of the stones. We need to secure the roundabout and see any cars that might appear have safe passage through," Drew quickly told the nodding men. "You two take up position at the other two roads, stop them at the junction, check it's clear before sending them through." "Bloody hell, they're shifting this thing," Jim interjected quietly. "Yes, though how we actually do it is another question," Drew realised. Seeing the stone now made him wonder if they were perhaps being a bit ambitious. "Aye, best of luck getting that out of there," Jim nodded at it doubtfully. "Well, come on, Jim, let's get to us post," Bob told him. "He's got a bus full of squaddies coming down the hill to help him. I'm sure they can manage it without us." They wandered off to their posts with Jim shaking his head. Soon more policemen arrived, and Drew assigned them to gaps along the perimeter of the roundabout. Soon a line of men had appeared around the edge, as was a slowly gathering crowd as people visiting the shops paused to goggle at what was happening. Mrs. Lancaster stopped to wonder what was going on, and she was soon joined by Sarah Hollis from the greengrocers. "Yeah, there's a lot of bobbies appearing up there," Sarah told her. "Aye, what are they up to?" Mrs. Lancaster asked. "I don't know, I just spotted them now." "Do you think it's another body?" Mrs. Hollis asked her. "I don't know, dear, but there's definitely something going on over there." Their heads bobbed up and down as they tried to catch a glance of what could be causing so much excitement. A few cars drove slowly past, helped along by Jim and Bob. For a minute all was quiet, and those gathering at the roundabout held their breath in anticipation for what would come. Drew had been stood at the junction, staring up the road, straining his ears for the slightest hint of coach engine. Finally he saw the familiar blue bus chugging down the hill. "All right, gents, here they come," he shouted to his colleagues in warning. "Looks like something's about to happen," Mrs. Lancaster said, nodding at the policemen as they began preparing for action. Word travelled around the few shoppers that had assembled, and when the coach appeared on the roundabout a small gasp of awe escaped from them. It pulled up on the side of the road next to the roundabout, and the army men pulled out and followed the archaeologists over to the rock. "Well, I never! Look at that lot!" Ivy Cole exclaimed. "Yes," Mrs. Lancaster replied nervously. "Must be that lot up the road. They found some old stones, you know." "Some stones, yes." Ivy Cole was caught between rushing off to get her friends and staying to see what would happen. She decided to rush off to find Mrs. Tolhurst and told everyone she saw on her way about the events unfolding. The few people that had been vying for a view of the stones up the hill slowly trickled down behind the coach, and after a few minutes a small crowd had gathered to watch from the roundabout's perimeter. When the men began examining the stone, Drew joined them. "What do we think?" he asked Sampson, who stood examining it with the Major. "Well, if we start digging a bit further back, I reckon from about here," he stood at the side of the stone where the ground was lower, "and make our way forward like this," he waved an arm from where he stood toward the stone. "Being careful of the stone, of course, then we should be able to reach the bottom fine," the Major told him. "We could probably lever it out from there." "Good, let's get going then," Drew told them. The Major nodded to his men, and they cleared a space for the pickaxes to swing. "Here we go." Mrs. Lancaster tapped her friend's elbow, and the collection of people watched in wonder as the first pickaxe struck the cold, hard ground. Chapter 91. The inspector arrived at the site with the truck and the digger a little later than he would have liked, but was pleased to see that work had already begun. John had to park the truck further up the road to prevent any holds-up forming, and the inspector left him there and rushed over to the dig. "Drew," the inspector called as he approached. "Ah, hello, Inspector," Drew called back. He approached the Firestone and studied the progress, pleased to see the hole around it was deepening quickly. The ground was hard and cold, unwilling to give up its prize. As the men dug, there was a commotion at the perimeter, and a policeman approached the inspector with a rather bothered-looking Simon, the archaeologist from the stones. "Ah, good afternoon," the inspector welcomed him, recognising him from the day before. "Stop this!" he yelled at the men, ignoring the inspector. The men bore him no mind and continued unabated. Simon realised he was a little powerless to stop them, so approached the inspector instead. "You have to stop this. You are destroying a historical site. You can't just remove it," he shouted indignantly. "Yes, true, it is a historical site," the inspector replied quietly. A few murmurs echoed around the crowd at Simon's intervention, just as he had wanted. "But it is also the scene of historical vandalism," the inspector continued calmly. "The stones were buried, and we have revealed them. Would you rather have had them remain hidden to respect it as a historical site?" "Well, that's a bit different," the flustered man erupted. "What's he doing?" Mrs. Lancaster asked her friend. "Who is he?" asked Mavis from the Green Man, who had rushed down when she had heard what was going on. "I don't know, but he's not happy," Phyllis May from the tea shop commented. "I think he's trying to stop them." Ivy Cole had returned in time to see the events unfolding. "Stop who?" Ernie had taken a break from offering the roofers from Nettlewood tea to come and see what was going on. "The men, he's trying to stop them from moving the stone." "Oh, is that what they're doing?" Mrs. Lancaster replied in a hushed voice. "I never thought I'd see the day. Wonder where they're going to move it anyway," Mrs. Earnshaw pondered out loud. "Why are they moving it then?" Jerry from the Barbers, who had been stood behind them, asked. "How should we know?" they replied in unison. "Finally, that horrible thing's being moved," Jerry told them. "Shush!" someone else interjected, bending their ear towards the conversation. "The Firestone is in the wrong place," the inspector was telling Simon. "It should be returned to restore the stones to their historically accurate design." There was a ripple of applause from the assembled crowd of Firestone residents who had heard what the inspector had said. Dr. Sampson suddenly noticed what was happening and left their work at the Firestone to interject. "Simon, it's fine." He tugged at his friend's arm to pull him away. "Look, come and watch them removing it. This is real history. We're righting an ancient wrong." Seeing Sampson insisting with the stone's removal, Simon stood down. He was not so much admitting he was wrong as bowing to the pressure of the crowd. The army men dug down until they found the end of the stone, and as Sampson had predicted, it was at least 10 feet long. "Now we have to work out how we're going to get it out of the ground," Sampson informed his disgruntled colleague Simon, the soldiers, the inspector, and Drew. "We still have the digger at our disposal," the major reminded him, "and the truck." The inspector looked about the stone. "Do you think we could get some rope attached, lift it out with a digger and place it on the truck?" he asked the major. And the major was also looking down at the stone, and the same plan was forming in his head. "I believe it's probably our best bet," he agreed, "but I don't think it's going to be easy. Unless we had some sort of brace above it, we could put a rope over it and pull it out," Drew suggested. The inspector eyed the scaffolding that had been half erected around Ernie's house. "I believe I might have just the thing," he told them. Chapter 92. Between the trees, shapes danced. Unseen by the crowds, hidden in the dark, they oozed. They squeezed and squashed, ebbing for a view, watching the crowd, watching the men digging at the Firestone. They felt the change. They felt the flow releasing, changing direction. They felt the bubble of energy slow and its expansion ease. They saw, they felt, and they waited, as they had for so long, except now they knew. Now they knew they would not have to wait much longer. Chapter 93. While the inspector stalked off to try and convince Ernie's scaffolders to help them, Drew took the men that weren't digging back to the bus to collect all the rope they could find. They returned with arms full to find the inspector carefully guiding a truck of scaffold poles over to the stones. The truck's doors advertised them as being the Brake brothers. When the truck was parked safely, they jumped out of the cab, and a conference began between the inspector, the major, the Brake brothers, and the archaeologists. "It will need to be high enough to get the stone in the air and the truck underneath," the inspector explained. The scaffolders looked about the place and did a quick calculation. "How are you going to lift it out?" the older brother asked. The inspector motioned toward the heap of rope Drew and the soldiers had gathered. "I think we'll need more than that." The major shook his head doubtfully. "And I don't think your truck will take the weight," the younger scaffolder informed him, adding to the woes. "There's a good 25 ton of stone there." The inspector stopped for a second, suddenly realising he was going to need another plan. "Dr. Sampson, how would the stones have been moved originally?" he asked. "Ah, well, interesting question, Inspector," he informed him, pleased his time to contribute had finally come, "and a matter that is up for debate. While some believe the stones were moved by water from their home in South Wales, others say the stone's weight would have been too heavy to float. Another theory is—" The inspector held up a hand. "How would they have got the stones across land, if they wanted to move them a few hundred yards up the road?" The inspector narrowed his question down for the excitable doctor. "Oh, I see. Well, yes. Still an interesting question. The general consensus is that they would have been rolled along on logs. As the rolled logs underneath the stones, they would have been passed back to the front." The inspector studied the stone, thought about the distance it had to travel and how easy it would be to do. "That would use a lot less rope," the major informed him. "And you could use the truck to pull it up the hill," the scaffolder nodded. "We could use some of our poles to push it out onto the trunks," he suggested. "All we need is some trunks." "Yes, but we still need you to construct something to lift it on top of the stones," the inspector informed them, thinking out loud. "If you could head up there and start constructing, I would be most appreciative. I will reimburse you, of course, for your help." The men nodded eagerly, caught up in the excitement. "Major, take half your men and look for large trunks of a similar circumference in the piles of wood up near the site that we can roll the stone on. We'll need to trim them down to ensure they can roll comfortably. The other half can keep digging here, and we'll try and work out how we can get the stone out of the hole and onto the trunks." The men all nodded and made their way off to their tasks. "Do you think the rope will be strong enough to lift it?" Drew asked, marvelling at its size. "No, I think we'll need something stronger," the inspector admitted. "I could go up to Gerald's garage, see if he could help," Drew suggested. "Yes, good thinking," the inspector agreed. "I'm going to remain here for now, try to keep things moving," the inspector told him. The entire area had descended into bedlam as different people began coming and going, preparing themselves. Drew headed off to the garage while the scaffolders removed a few poles to try and prise the stone out, then drove carefully through the crowd to begin constructing a frame to lift the lintel onto the standing stones. Samson and Simon stood over the men as they hacked at the soil, anxious that the stone didn't get damaged and that any other artefact hidden under the stone remained intact. Almost as quickly as the soldiers left to find trunks, they began returning with them. After an hour, a pile of 20 trimmed-down trunks had accumulated, and Drew returned to the roundabout with Gerald in his tow truck, laden with chain. By this time the rock was well exposed on one side, and the men began carefully freeing it from the remaining soil. The mud had only been removed from one side, to allow it to be lifted and carefully tipped onto the trunks on its side. The accumulating trunks were laid out, Gerald's truck was positioned, and the trains were carefully attached to the stone. The long scaffolding poles were poked onto the end of the stone, with men queuing up to help lever the stone out. "Here we go then," Dr. Sampson gasped to Simon. Neither men could believe what they were witnessing. It was all happening so quickly. The inspector checked everyone was ready. Then, with a wave of his hand, the task began. Gerald slowly pulled forward with his truck, the chains straining under the weight. The men all pulled at the poles, the weight seeming too much for their combined efforts at first, but gradually, slowly, the stone began to shift from its hole. As it rose, it slowly tipped, then, almost gracefully, it slowly dived groundward until it was horizontal for the first time in several hundred years. As it landed on the trunks, the ground reverberated with the powerful thud it made. The crowd strained for a view of what was happening, and when it hit the ground, a small ripple of applause flitted amongst the assembled people. A flutter of rain erupted onto the scene, but undeterred, the inspector prepared everyone for the next phase. "Gerald, you're doing a marvellous job. Please take care while we arrange ourselves," the inspector called to him. Gerald raised a hand to show his understanding and awaited instructions. The inspector made his way over to the stone, where the men were laying the logs out behind the truck in preparation. "Marvellous, yes, that's it." The inspector was pleased the men were able to organise themselves so efficiently. The major mingled in between them to hurry them along, ensuring the logs were evenly spaced. "I think we're ready, Inspector," he called when all logs were in place. "Thank you, Major," the inspector called back. A group of men stood at the rear of the stone, ready to begin lifting the logs to the front of the line. The atmosphere was alive, the excitement in the air was tangible, and the crowd watched on in a hushed awe. "Thank you, Gerald. Let's begin slowly up the hill, shall we?" the inspector called to him, and the truck began to inch slowly forward. The men jumped into action. The logs were moved quickly and carefully, and the stone began its journey rolling on logs to the stones with an entourage of almost 100 people. When they reached the stones, almost an hour later, the edges of the horizon were beginning to darken. The scaffolders had done the inspector proud, having constructed a huge frame that towered above the standing stones. The men were still active, but their energy was waning. The policemen stood at the mouth of the path in the copse to hold the crowd at bay for their own safety. Stone was rolled into position under the frame, and more ropes and chains were tied around it to help guide it into place. When all was prepared, and the chains reattached to Gerald's powerful truck, everyone stood waiting, ready for the next instruction. "Everyone ready?" the inspector called. A general murmur of readiness echoed about the trees. "Gerald?" the inspector called to the truck, and a hand appeared to indicate he was ready. "Right, slowly then please, here we go," the inspector called, and the truck moved slowly forward.